My name is Dwayne Bradshaw, Director of Career Development for the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and Brian Barr, my Assistant Director of Career Development. We're the career services team with the Schar School that will help you in your career process in how you're wanting to find positions, or if you're wanting to change careers, or if you're wanting to further your career. We're definitely the team that will be able to assist you with that. Today, we're going to be discussing career outcomes of our alumni as they've gone through the program. And we have two wonderful alumni who have joined us today, and we'll be introducing them in just a few minutes, that can provide some really interesting background on what their process was and where they've ended up once they graduated. So the first thing that you're probably wondering is, in getting a degree at the Schar School, what can you anticipate being able to do once you graduate? It's pretty broad spectred. A lot of our students do end up going into government or things related to government. So as you can see from the pie chart here, federal government and government contracting and consulting does account for a good chunk of what our students do, around 40%, a little over that. And then we have students that then go into also state and local governments. But we also have students that are interested in more general business sector things, also within NGOs and nonprofits, multilateral organizations such as World Bank, IMF, UN, and people that also go into higher ed or academia. So it's pretty broad what you can do with these degree programs, and it's also dependent on the type of degree that you're seeking. So for someone like biodefense, you're probably going into federal agencies dealing with the pandemic, or you may be working with consulting firms that are dealing with pandemic issues. Whereas something more broad-based like Masters of Public Policy or Masters of Public Administration, you could end almost anywhere. It's a pretty broad spectrum. So it really depends on what your degree program is. It can also depend on what your focus is in terms of a concentration or an emphasis that your degree program may provide, and the types of electives you take to try to specialize in a specific area of knowledge or skill set. I think what's important to know, and that what a lot of students ask, is if I'm investing all of this time and money into a degree, am I going to actually get a job once I graduate? And the nice thing to know is that within 3 months of graduation, approximately 92% of our graduates have a degree or have a position specific to their degree. 3% have decided to go on for additional professional school training. Usually that's a PhD program. And within 3 months, 5 people are still seeking employment within their chosen industry or sector. So to help you through the process and to provide you resources and a listening ear to help you through it, we provide lots of different resources that you can utilize. I think the important thing is the one-on-one appointments and coaching that we can do. So we'll sit down with students, whether in person or virtually, which is what has been during the pandemic. If you want to try to sketch out thinking about different fields or where I want to go, what would be the process for that? How could I do it? What might be some things that I might want to do through that, such as, do I need to get an internship so that I'm got experience and can be a viable applicant for full-time positions? We'll sit down with you and discuss all that. We'll look over your resume and your cover letter if you're applying for positions. We'll talk with you about your job and internship search, what sort of resources might be available to help you through that in finding those positions. going through interviewing skills or a mock interview, and I'll say Brian is the genius in that front. You should definitely reach out to him if you need help with mock interviews and salary negotiations. We both do salary negotiations as well. We do have lots of online resources on the Schar School website as well. As a part of that, we have Schar School Handshake, which is our jobs database. All of the positions that we receive from employers go directly into that system. It's also a larger system that has many positions from all of the different employers that are interested in recruiting from Mason in general. I also get lots of positions from faculty and their networks, so those go into the system as well. And I send out a Friday jobs email to the student listserv with all of these new opportunities to prompt you to go into Handshake and see what they are and how to apply. Typically in any given week, we have 30 to 50 positions that are posted, from full-time to paid internships, unpaid internships, fellowships, various events in the community that might be of interest. It's a lot of stuff there. You also have the ability to get academic credit for an internship. Depending on the program, you might be required to do one as academic credit. The Masters of Public Policy, the Masters of Public Administration, and the Organization Development and Knowledge Management programs have an internship requirement or a capstone course requirement. If you have at least 2 years of experience, you can waive out of that. For anyone else, if you want to do an internship for academic credit, you have the ability to do that as one of your electives. And we also do lots of different programming and events throughout the semester and the year. Lots of different workshops, webinars. We bring, Brian specifically works with our Alumni Chapter, which is very active with our school in doing different career panels. We have employer information sessions, lots of different events, and we market those to you every semester, send you reminders about them so you can register and attend. We also do the Student Services Seminar Series. Fall is usually focused on academic success, which Paul Nooney, our Associate Director of Academic Advising, is the one that works with Brian on presenting that. And then we have our professional development program, which is in the spring, which Brian spearheads, and Paul works with him on that closely. We also do a career fair every spring, usually in February, of employers that are actively seeking to recruit our graduate students for their specialized skill sets and knowledge. So these are either full-time, part-time internship positions that are specific to graduate level skill requirements and knowledge. So you're not just going to be sitting there making coffee, making copies. You're actually going to be doing substantial work related to your degree program that will help you make yourself marketable. And the employers will be providing opportunities potentially for full-time positions as well. This year, this past February, we did it virtually. We had, I think it was 33 employers that attended. We usually have somewhere between 35 to 40 employers, and we'll be excited to get that back in person again once the pandemic ends. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Brian, and he will introduce our alumni panelists and have them go into their stories. So Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Real quick before we get started, there was a question that came through on the chat. They asked, how did you define employed in the previous 92% stat? So back a couple of slides.
Okay. That's a really good question. Those were people that were full-time employed in their careers of interest or were in the military. Some people were in the military. Some people were doing fellowships or internships that would eventually lead to a full-time position. The percentage, what wasn't counted there was either if they were continuing their graduate studies to a PhD program, or they were either volunteering or they were unemployed. So 92% accounts for full-time employment within their fields of interest, or if they were in the military, or if they were doing fellowships or internships that would eventually lead to a full-time position.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So without further ado, then I'd like to introduce our alumni panelists. First, I'll introduce Dixie Downing. She graduated with her Master's of Public Policy in 2020 with her concentration in U.S. international trade. Sorry, that's not the concentration. But she is currently working at the U.S. International Trade Commission. And our other panelist, Louis Al-Hashimi, graduated with his Master's of Public Administration in 2020. He now works for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as a Presidential Management Fellow. And so I'm very interested to hear kind of what their pathways to those positions were, because I've worked with both of them before. They're both wonderful, wonderful people. And I know what a storied history there is. So without said, I'd like to pass it to Dixie first to just introduce yourself and kind of, what is your life story?
Oh, wow. Well, my name's Dixie. First of all, I really need to apologize. My animals love to be the center of attention, and they're very active right now. And so if they distract you, I'm very sorry. But yeah, actually, my journey to my job is a pretty common and I guess systematic one. I don't know, I'll explain it. So I did my undergrad in economics at Texas A&M University. I'm from Dallas. At A&M, I learned a lot about international development, and I really thought that I was going to go off and change the world and help people. And my professor at A&M, my international development professor, told me that I should get a graduate degree in public policy, which is how I ended up at Mason. Basically, the year was 2018, and my dog and I arrived in DC, and we were all bright-eyed and ready to change the world. And we quickly realized that everyone had a master's degree and was really cool in this town. So we figured out that it was time for us to get our act together. And she sent me off, and I got a job at the school working for the communications manager. His name is Buzz McLean. And as the reporter, I was able to learn a lot and network and really kind of learn about what all the school has to offer. The school has to offer a lot of things to people. And one of those things was the professional development program that Brian Barr and Paula Nooney put on. At that time, I knew that I really needed to get an internship and get something federal government on my resume. And I did not know how to write a cover letter. I would have rather have eaten a tire than write a cover letter. And they were able to really help me out with that. They were also able to help me fine tune my resume and I guess make it so that I could come off professional in a professional setting. But yeah, I applied to something like 50 internships, and I finally landed one at Treasury, which was in the Office of Economic Policy. I did it in the summer of 2019. I did it for academic credit. It's very easy to do that if that's something you're interested in. Of course, my goal was to change the world and go into international development. But as soon as I started at Treasury, they immediately threw me into international trade, because at that time it was the Trump administration and they were really big on trade. And weirdly enough, I was really into it, and I really liked working on modeling and forecasting and using data analysis to solve all these really complicated trade problems, which was how I ended up getting a pathways internship at the Trade Commission. So that was immediately after my internship at Treasury. I started at the Trade Commission, and I they have me working on like a variety of things. It's hard to explain what we do at the Trade Commission because it's everywhere. Like I've worked on censorship, I've worked on illicit trade, I've worked on environmental stuff. Basically, as an economist, you're kind of like a catch-all, kind of like the MPP program. It's a little bit of a catch-all. So I'm really glad I went into it because I did not think this is where I was going to end up. But at the Schar School, I would say if you're interested in trade, the class that I got the most out of was Andrea Viski's Strategic Trade Controls class. You might be in that class and think it's so boring and you have to look at all these lists, but trust me, out of all the classes I took, my day-to-day uses those lists all the time and it helped me out so much. But yeah, somehow after I graduated, they hired me on as an international economist. I am the subject matter expert in nanotechnology, 3D printing, and smartphones. I mostly work on anti-dumping, fact-finding, and unfair import investigations. And I plan on staying there for some time and then, I don't know, maybe going back to Treasury. But that is my life story.
Thank you so much, Dixie. Louis, will you be able to share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Louis Al-Hashimi. I'll share a little bit about my journey professionally and what got me to the Schar School. So back in 2014, I finished my undergraduate studies at the University of Pittsburgh. I had a social sciences background. And I was curious to get some working experience, get a feel for the working world prior to pursuing graduate studies. And I found it pretty challenging at the time. I had a few different internships, eventually found my way into the DC area. Similar to Dixie, I was interested in international work initially, but I eventually found myself drawn to local government where I can work in public service and get a more direct sense of the impact of my work. So eventually I worked in a few different fields in local government. I worked in human services, community services, and environmental services. I'm more of a generalist as opposed to a specialist. I've worn a lot of hats over the years and just had a lot of different titles and positions. And eventually it led me to consider the Schar School MPA program. I was interested in public service going back to my high school days. And I wanted to grow professionally. I felt like pursuing the MPA program would equip me with the knowledge and skills to be in more of a management position somewhere within government. So that was kind of my thinking going into the Schar School when I enrolled in 2018. And in terms of professional development, my mindset was to try to be as proactive as possible and to take advantage of the resources available to me. So just thinking back to my job search following my undergraduate days and how challenging it was, I knew that my graduate studies would be over fairly quickly. You know, the years would go by quick, and I wanted to be in a good position to take the next step. So really the first year of my graduate program, I was a part-time student. I was a full-time intern with Arlington County, which was only a few metro stops away from the Arlington campus. And I took advantage of a lot of those resources and events that Dwayne shared earlier, those resume workshops, salary and interview workshops, as well as the alumni networking events, just to try to put myself out there, try to build my network, get a feel for building the necessary skills to approach just the application process and the interview process. Even though at that point I was passively looking at opportunities, still wasn't actively searching. Then come around summer of 2019, I was a few semesters in. I was looking for a different opportunity. And that's when I tapped into the mock interviews that Brian does. And he helped me with an application to an internship in economic development with the county, with Arlington County. And that opportunity didn't pan out. I didn't get selected or offered that position, but it informed my approach for future positions and applications that I was a part of. So then come around fall of 2019, I decided to go back to school full-time to become a full-time student. And I was a part-time research assistant to go along with that. I wanted to dedicate more time to finishing my degree faster and finding the next step afterwards. So within my last year, 2019 going into 2020, again, I was taking advantage of those resources, attending career fairs, browsing Handshake. And then come around September of 2019, there was actually a PMF alumni information session, which is the Presidential Management Fellowship, a civil service fellowship in the federal government for recent graduates. And there I got to hear from Mason alumni from the Schar School, as well as other schools like the law school, in terms of how they navigated that application process. It's a very competitive process in that case. It requires about a 2-hour assessment, similar to what you would take in the GRE or the GMAT. So it was very time intensive, but the information session was helpful. It helped me become a finalist for the fellowship. And then I was able to apply for positions that were exclusive to that fellowship within the federal government across different agencies. So then come around winter and spring of 2020, I started to get in touch with a few of those alumni who had been in PMF positions. I consulted them for tips on navigating the application process, navigating the interview process. I was also applying for state fellowships, state government fellowships. I continued to do mock interviews with Brian. Some opportunities didn't pan out, but again, it informed my approach for other opportunities and positions that opened up. So come around spring of 2020, I actually had a few offers that came my way, some simultaneously, and this was a new position for me. Again, compared to my undergraduate days, I was looking for just any offer I could find, but now I had to navigate multiple offers, which is a good problem to have. And again, I relied on Dwayne and Brian for their expertise, how to manage that process, how to negotiate. And I found that helpful, especially in the context of COVID-19. In March 2020, that's when most things went remote. So that threw a wrench in everybody's plans. But thankfully, it was helpful to just touch base with them and have them kind of walk me through the process. And I was able to negotiate a telework arrangement where I could work from home in Pittsburgh for the Centers for Disease Control, the position that I eventually accepted. Rather than moving to a new city during the pandemic, I thought it would make more sense just to move back home in the remote telework environment. So again, they were able to help me through that. And that's where I am right now. I started in the fall, back in September. I'm about 7 months in. I'm currently an operations analyst for an environmental health lab within the agency. And I basically help manage the operational side, the administrative side of things within the division so that the scientists can focus on their research as much as possible. So that in a nutshell is my journey of how I got to where I am right now.
That's perfect. And apologies for the lulls. I'm trying to keep myself from talking while muted. So I'm just going to make sure I don't do that. So we have had a couple of questions come in, but I'm going to start this off with just a very simple question of why did you initially choose the program with the Schar School that you did? And Dixie, we'll have you start.
Well, I don't really know if this is the answer that you're looking for, but it's the honest one. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do international development. I knew I wanted to go into public service and help people. And public policy seemed like kind of a catch-all program, something where I could possibly take that international development route, or I could take a different route. And it's definitely true. I think one of the questions was, were there any that says challenges. Never mind, we'll get to that. Some of the good things about my program were that you can really take a lot of different classes and it's very easy to get approved with your advisor. And so kind of, as I was taking international security or international trade classes, I was figuring it out along the way, and I don't know, I ended up all right. So that was why, because I was lost.
It's a valid answer. Louis, what do you got?
Yeah, so for me, I did have some experience working in local government, and I worked across a few different fields. So again, I was more of a generalist, and I was interested in a degree that would be more of a catch-all, that would, leave the door open to a range of opportunities. And in terms of the roles that I had, they were mostly operational in nature. So that's what led me to lean towards the MPA program as opposed to the MPP program, which is more analytical and more research-based. So that was kind of my reasoning, and just more broadly in terms of something that's motivated me throughout my career, my academic and professional career, is just an interest in service. And that's, I think, one thing that drew me towards government in particular, first at the local level and now at the federal level. And that's been a constant driving factor in my professional development.
Certainly. And so this next question ties a little bit into that. But were there any challenges within the Schar program? And Elizabeth also asks, can you also give someone who is newly coming into their program some advice, whether academic or general? And Louis, why don't we have you keep on rolling?
Mm-hmm. There were definitely setbacks. I mentioned there were some interviews and positions that I was really interested in, and they didn't come my way. And I worked closely with Brian to prepare for those applications. So that was definitely difficult to deal with at times. I mentioned there was one position with Arlington County that really interested me. It would have been a full-time paid position with some benefits, and it didn't pan out. And eventually, that's when I decided to go back to school full-time. So although the setback was kind of difficult at the moment, it did give me a better sense of what to look for moving forward. Then come around later in my program, when I had more interviews, I had a better sense of what to look for within the interview process, not just looking at the position itself, but also looking at the conversation I'm having with the people I'm interviewing, kind of picturing them as future colleagues or future supervisors. So there are definitely some setbacks in terms of the job search or career development. But the way I thought of it was just to think of it as practice and ways to kind of get better, so that I'd come around graduation time ready to take that next step.
Awesome. And Dixie, do you have any comments on any challenges or any kind of advice that you would recommend?
Yes. So kind of depending on what, hey Brian, kind of depending on what your career field is, if you are in the MPP program or really any Schar program and you want to go into a career field that involves more quantitative analysis, you can take classes in the economics school and also in the engineering school. I didn't know that at my time in the Schar School, and those would have really benefited me in my career now. The good thing about the government is that it's like impossible to fire you. And so they will really train you as best as they can. And so I've had a lot of catching up to do with my peers. And I wish I could have taken classes that were on like forecasting or partial equilibrium modeling or something like that.
Right, that's a very good point. I think it's the buyer's remorse, if you will, to a degree. I was in a very different program, educational leadership and policy analysis, and there was definitely some times where it was like, man, I wish I had gone into a little bit more of the financial aspects of higher ed, just to learn a little bit more about that. And so it's always good to be able to kind of find out some of those different augmented areas or ways to augment your education. Yeah. And so the next question I'm going to ask, it was in the chat, and I'm going to specifically ask you, Louis, because while it is not the same thing, the Presidential Management Fellows program has very similar qualities to it in terms of the exam, in terms of a number of other things. So I think you probably know where I'm going with this. But the person asked, what steps would you recommend to someone wanting to become a Foreign Service officer? You know, if you want to talk a little bit about, you know, how you prepared for the exam, how you kind of prepared for kind of applying for the Presidential Management Fellows. I know it's not a direct one-to-one translation, but any advice that you have around that might be helpful.
Sure. So there are probably some parallels between the PMF application process and the Foreign Service officer application process. They both require an exam or an assessment, and they're both within the federal government. One thing I learned just going through the application process is that things are pretty spelled out within the federal government. You know, things are subject to legislation and congressional rules. So lots of things have pretty stringent requirements. So there are particular things that they're looking for each of these positions or career paths. So I would recommend doing some research specific to that career path, perhaps trying to get in touch with some alumni who are currently in that position, who have taken the Foreign Service exam and are currently Foreign Service officers, and try to get some tips from them in terms of how to approach the application process. For me, I found it helpful. Again, just approaching the PMF application similar to how I would approach taking the GRE or the GMAT, you know, just setting aside dedicated time, you know, being in a quiet place, and really just focusing on the task at hand. One thing that might be helpful is that there was an essay section, a timed essay section in the PMF application process. There might be something like that in the Foreign Service one. And I remember a simple piece of advice was just to answer the question, which sounds really simple, but you know, in the time crunch that's allowed, it can be easy to just ramble and, you know, just type all sorts of things that might not really answer the question. And again, you know, the federal requirements are pretty stringent, I would imagine, for the Foreign Service application process. So it's important to have that attention to detail. But yeah, I think it starts with networking and trying to get a sense of who is currently along that path and what steps they took to get there.
I think a really good point from what you just said is more or less identifying, is that a right path for you? It could be something where something like Foreign Service might not necessarily be the exact position that would be a great fit for you, but maybe a more administrative one within the Department of State or the Department of Agriculture, which also does have like Foreign Service officer positions. So it's identifying a little bit more within yourself, kind of what your career ambitions are, and realistically kind of what ultimately your goal is within that. And I think talking to alumni, networking is a great way to answer that question. Thank you, Louis, for answering that. And I'm going to shift it over to Dixie and ask, what aspects of your Schar School experience and coursework do you feel were most helpful and beneficial during your job search process?
So they really talked about my data analysis course. They wanted to know all about that. I got offered more of an administrative position at State, and they actually wanted to know more about my introductory classes and what kind of research the Schar School is having us do for our term papers and stuff like that. So they were both really different. This job was more interested in my trade classes, which I didn't have many of at the time. And so they were like, oh, we'll bring you on as a pathways and then impress us when you graduate. And so that's a hard one. I just cannot harp on Andrea Biesky's class enough. It was really good. If you're interested in trade, she in somehow a whole semester encompasses all of those boring lists and teaches you how to use them. So it was a really helpful class.
I'm sure to some people they're very intriguing, certainly to the faculty. But thank you. That's excellent. Louis, next question I'm going to ask is regarding salary negotiation. Knowing that both of you are a part of an industry that doesn't do a traditional salary negotiation like you'd find with like a nonprofit or a for-profit company. But Louis, if you could just walk us through a little bit about what your negotiation process looked like. How did you end up?
Oh no.
Can you hear me? Looks like we might have lost Brian.
I can hear you just fine. I think Brian froze up there. So if you could just go ahead and delve into that question.
Okay. Yeah, I think I got most of it. So the salary negotiation process looks a little different for federal positions. Again, the requirements at the federal civil service are pretty stringent and spelled out. In the case of the PMF positions I was applying for, the minimum requirement was just to have a graduate degree to start at the GS9 salary level. Myself, I did have a few years of full-time experience in local civil service. So I wanted to see if I could negotiate a slightly higher grade and step at the federal level. Again, this was a new process for me, but I figured it could be a learning one, just a chance to try to negotiate, even if it didn't result in much. So I remember in the spring of my last semester, I had a few offers, and there was only one where I tried to negotiate some salary or benefits. At the time, I was most interested in relocation benefits. Since I would be moving to Atlanta, at least that was the plan at the time. And I figured, if I can't get a salary increase, perhaps I can get some relocation assistance. And then I thought to myself, if I can't get that, perhaps I can get some telework benefits. So I kind of thought of it in terms of three things to ask for. And I think that's what Dwayne and Brian recommended, not to ask for more than 3 things. So in those conversations, they took place via email and via phone. Wasn't able to get much progress in terms of the salary. Again, it's pretty bureaucratic. In terms of relocation assistance, I did have some assistance offered to me, but then it was actually taken back. There was a bit of a miscommunication, but things worked out eventually. Just because of COVID-19, things went into maximum telework, and then come around later in the summer, before I got my final transcripts, I was able to negotiate just teleworking from Pittsburgh, which was more convenient for me. And in that way, I was able to save more money. So I just viewed it as a learning experience, a chance to try to grow from that process itself. And again, it was helpful to call upon Dwayne and Brian just for their insight.
And that can be particularly difficult within any sort of government, federal, state, or local, because they may not have the flexibility in negotiating salary, but other things, other benefits may be negotiable. So Dixie, would you like to give your thoughts or comments on the salary negotiation process?
Sure. So I guess one of the perks about federal government salary negotiation processes is that it's not with your boss, it's with HR, and your boss is not privy at all to these negotiations. He has no idea, or she has no idea what's going on. And so it's what I did was I am randomly a paralegal back in Texas. And so I brought all of everything on my resume together and somehow crunched it into this amount of experience. And I was able to get a step increase from that. But they're really open to it. I think whenever you say you want to negotiate, they always come at you with a higher number. And it's a little bit daunting at first because I'm like, should I just take it? Oh God. But you just got to keep going. And I think the other thing that's important to mention is that the negotiations do not end whenever you get the job. Whenever it comes time for your promotion, you've got to make sure that you have an outline of everything that you've done over the past year. And like, if it sounds a little sleazy, but like if it's a lot more than one of your coworkers, then you can say like, I don't think it's fair that this person makes the same amount as me when I'm doing twice as much work. And that stuff does work in order to get you some extra step increases on your promotion. And so it's, oh man, I shouldn't have said that. I do not endorse slander, but I will say you just got to like pull out all the stops to get in your negotiations, and they are always ready for it. But you've also got to be equally as ready for them.
I would definitely agree with that. It's not that you're trying to say that you're doing more than someone else, but if you've got more responsibilities, that should be reflected in your salary. So you have to be the person that's being proactive on that point.
Yeah, as much as it's like harsh to say, an employer is never going to advocate for you. You have to advocate for yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know that Brian's going to be able to rejoin us. He texted and said that he lost his internet connection. So we'll see if we'll go on from here. So we answered that one. And the other two questions that have come up aren't really as specific to our alumni, but I'll try to answer them. For Michael, he asked about is there any sort of employment statistics specific to any of the MPA concentrations? And unfortunately, there is not. We haven't gotten that far down into delving into tracking. We can do it for the degrees, but not within each of the concentrations, because that may not be reflected. It isn't reflected in the surveying that is done to the graduates or the people that will be graduating the semester that they graduate. So unfortunately, I can give some anecdotal ideas, and I certainly would be willing to do that offline. So Michael, if you wanted to email me, my email address, and let me put it up on the chat really quick. So that's where you can reach me, and I'd be glad to either speak with you over email or over the phone or on Zoom would be fine. We see that Brian's back. Brian, I just dealt with the MPA concentrations and the question that was about, do we break down employment data based on the concentrations, which unfortunately we don't, but I can give some anecdotal evidence. So that's been answered.
Good. I no longer have access to the questions that have been asked.
Okay, well, we've gone through all of the questions that had been asked.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Through the Q&A. There is an additional one that was posted on the chat that is asking about, let's see here. Specifically, Davis is looking, does some work with a digital media advocacy firm, and he is interested in the potential of being able to connect with advocacy or nonprofit organizations. So I don't know that that's something specific that the alumni would be able to answer, but we certainly have a lot of resources that could try to put you in touch with nonprofits and advocacy organizations within the DC region.
Yeah, it's certainly a situation where you could connect with different alumni. I think the mentorship program is also a really great resource. But I guess the question for the panelists for me would be, did you guys use any kind of specific networking strategies, or was there anybody you connected with that you were like, yeah, this is the keystone of my networking strategy with the Schar School or in my professional field? So let's bounce that to Dixie, I guess, first.
So you guys know I love Buzz McLean. He's the best. I would say that he's that person. He didn't get me my job, but he really pushed me to be more outgoing and to meet all these different people. And I also did the mentorship program, and he was another huge help. He was I guess like the assistant director of something at GAO. He was a really high up guy. So I definitely recommend the mentorship program, because you will be shocked at how cool and established these people are. But yeah, there wasn't really anyone that was the keystone to me getting my job other than people that just pushed me along the way to be better.
Very good. Louis, do you have anybody you have in mind, or?
Yeah, for me, I would say in my last year, when I was a research assistant, I was working closely with Dr. Conant, and his specialty is on state and local budgeting. And in addition to working in academia, he had some background working in state government as a legislative and budget analyst. So I found that I was able to connect with him pretty well in terms of our experience and interest in local government and service. So I really enjoyed working with him. We did some research on Medicaid expansion in Virginia and a few other states. I mentioned I previously worked in human services. My role there was as a Medicaid caseworker. So we had some common interests there. And then come around my last full-time semester, I was actually a student in his state and local budgeting class, and found that it was an interesting class. It actually counted as part of my policy concentration. It covered more than just budgeting and accounting, but it also tied in with demographics and history as well. So it was a really interesting class in that sense. And just the relationship I had with him led me to ask him to serve as a reference for my job applications. And then he recommended me for the position that I'm currently in. So that was really nice to see in terms of a relationship, being mutually beneficial.
Yeah, it can be one of the most tough things I think I experienced as a young adult in my profession was networking, figuring out how to make the ask, or specifically what to ask. And so I think what you both elicited there, definitely very applicable. I think it is those individuals that you work closely with, is the faculty, which are a very underutilized resource by a lot of students in terms of networking. And it's such a great scenario that with so many different positions, so many different experiences that, the faculty are able to connect you with just such a wide array. And so thank you both so much for answering that question. And so I haven't seen any new questions since. So I'll go back to kind of what here's one at the at the 11th hour. How does your current job line up with what you might have envisioned for a career going in? How did you know what you wanted? So I think that resonates a little bit with what you were saying earlier, Dixie, in terms of you wanted to do something different, and it's kind of changed a little bit since you've kind of gone through your career. And Louis, this might be true for you too. So after Dixie answers, if you have something to add to it as well, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, so as I've mentioned before, I am a paralegal back in Texas, which is completely different from anything I've talked about so far. I left undergrad and I wanted to be some kind of an advocate for people in developing countries within the government, and here I am. So I will say your career and your idea of what you want for your career might change, but at the Schar School, there are so many people who are willing to advocate for you, and there's so many resources that if you have something that you're like, this is me, I'm going to do this. Okay, that's great. There's a lot of people like that, and they do end up succeeding usually. But if you're also on the edge of, I don't know, then that's totally fine. What I did was I just took a bunch of classes in different fields. Like my electives are all over the place, and just kind of figured it out as I went. But I really like where I ended up, and I think I'll stay in trade for the rest of my life. It's a really small field actually, and you really get to know a lot of people in trade because we are a small community. And I really like where I ended up, and it was a complete fluke that I just so happened to work for the Trump administration, and they really wanted to take out China, and I was like, oh, I think I could, huh? But it was fun. That was me my entire time at Treasury. I was very confused the entire time because it was a really different environment. If you want to work for any of the executive offices or Treasury, come to me because I have a lot to say.
And Louis, given your statement earlier about being a little bit more of a generalist than a specialist, do you have anything to add in terms of the winding path that you've taken to your current career?
Right. So my interests were pretty broad, going back to my undergraduate days. And I think gradually over time, I've narrowed my interests, or at least kind of honed in on a few different themes that I'm drawn to. And I find that the current position that I'm in, suits my interests and experiences pretty well. I think just going back to school, in addition to working, helped me clarify those interests of mine, kind of figure out my core values or core drivers. Again, for me, being motivated by service and being driven by opportunities to have an impact. And I think for me, it kind of touches on something that Brian mentioned earlier about, figuring out if a position or a track is the right fit for you. And that is something worth considering. I think oftentimes it's easy to look at a position and think, on paper, this has a lot to offer for me, but you also have to think about if it's the right fit for you. Something like the Foreign Service program is something that I considered earlier in my undergraduate studies. I was considering more international opportunities, but then over time I realized I don't really like living abroad. I can't really picture myself being abroad, and I'm driven more by connection. In addition to service, just having an opportunity to build a connection with others. That's kind of what drew me to local government, and also what drew me to my current position. I just had a really good connection with my supervisor, the person that I spoke with, that I interviewed with. I'm part of a cohort of 30 other fellows, 30 other recent graduates. So it's been helpful to have that network to build connections with. And I find that where I am right now, it's also given me an idea of where I can move forward. I've come across the field of social determinants of health, which is something that I wasn't familiar with prior to joining the CDC, but it focuses more on the social aspects of public health, things like food insecurity, environmental design, social connectedness. So that's something that's on my radar in terms of what I might want to pursue later on. Again, just thinking of it more as a funnel, kind of having pretty broad interests and narrowing my focus over time. So I like where I am right now. Also in the PMF program, there's a lot of training opportunities. There's a chance to do a rotation for a few months. So I can still explore different interests outside of my current position.
Very good. An analogy I developed like half decade ago that I feel I always really kind of like stating is most people don't know what they want for dinner next week, Thursday. It's just they haven't done shopping. They haven't really thought too much about it. And honestly, until it gets to next Thursday, you might not have decided what you actually want for dinner then and there. And so internships, full-time employment, your careers are the exact same way. Just like it's okay to not necessarily know what you're going to be having dinner a week or more from now. It's totally okay if you don't know 1 year, 2 years down the road, kind of what your career is really going to look like. A lot of that shopping, the internships, the career development opportunities, these different events that you attend, like this one, a lot of that is doing the shopping for this and figuring out a little bit more about it. And so next question I'm going to ask, and I realized we're about 5 minutes, so there's enough, I think, time for one more question for each of you. And so I'm going to kind of split this one up a little bit because I think there's more socio landscape effects on employment currently than specifically just political. But we'll start with Dixie. How does the current political landscape, how has that affected your current employment? And how has a change of administration, has that provided any change?
So respect to Alejandro for wanting to get right down to the hot goss. I actually work for a nonpartisan agency, and the flip in administrations has definitely impacted us. Suddenly I'm filling out tariff forms every day on China, and suddenly they're like, no, you're actually going to be looking at the environment, and we're going to be studying how different trade agreements affect women. And it's way more what I want to be doing rather than filling out tariffs, because that's not the most interesting work, but it's definitely being felt. And at Treasury, it was the general feeling among the staff was that whatever you were going to do, it was going to be wrong. So just try and keep your job. And that was a kind of a toxic environment. I would think it's different now, because I feel like this administration might view economic policy differently. But yeah, it's just the general things that we're researching that are interesting to the administration has just taken a complete 180. And so even for a nonpartisan agency like mine, we're heavily feeling it.
And the way I'm going to change this question for you, Louis, is you started your position round about the time a whole bunch of stay-at-home orders were starting to be announced, as well as kind of the start of a global years-long pandemic. So talk us through a little bit about how did that affect your kind of decision? Did that affect kind of what roles you were looking at? And did it kind of affect what your overall goal was with your career?
Yeah, so it was tricky timing in terms of fielding some offers right around the time when stay-at-home orders went into effect and full-time telework went into effect. For me, I was towards the latter end of the application process. I hadn't applied to much other positions. By that point, I had a really good feeling about the direction I was leaning in and moving forward with the CDC. Just the conversation that I had with the supervisor, with my supervisor, was really encouraging. I found that I could relate to her pretty well. She also had an MPA program. She was a PMF alumna herself. And she also described herself as more of a generalist. So those were some things that I think really attracted me to that opportunity. And I think that kind of helped me hone in on that and not get too carried away with what was developing in terms of the pandemic, and also in terms of the election, the run up to the election. At the time, I didn't know, the extent of the pandemic and how things would unfold. I don't have a public health background, even though I work in a public health agency. So I couldn't really forecast, the types of changes that did occur. Again, for me, it was more about that conversation with my supervisor. But just coming around the turn of the executive administration and changes in congressional leadership, I've started to see some of those effects, how those changes in leadership shape civil service, which is often subject to legislation and executive orders, things like that. So I got to experience a little bit of that. I kind of came in at the tail end of the Trump administration and a congressional, one of the congressional sessions. And I'm sure that's something I'll experience more moving forward. That's something I wonder about, again, kind of compared to the local level where I have more experience and there isn't as much partisan or executive turnover.
So
one of the things that I would like to mention there, because I did have students throughout the year wondering what sort of public service they wanted to go into and whether they wanted to go into federal service or not. The important thing to know is that administrations change and their priorities change. So when I first started with the school, was the last year that George W. Bush was in office. And then you add a new administration. So not only did you have priority changes, but you also had people in Congress who were not reelected. So you had staff members with those people also looking for new jobs, political appointee changes. So those people looking for new jobs. Just keep in mind that regardless of who the administration is, there's always going to be work, core work that has to be done within an agency that always has to be done. And the administrations will change over time. And the secretaries of those agencies could change every couple of years. So their priorities will change depending on those changes. So I just thought I would throw that in.
Absolutely. I have a cousin who works for the Department of Energy. And it's just a very brief comment. She has never, nor does she believe she will ever meet a Secretary of Energy. And so she is far removed from that level of the process. And so I think it does change the nature of your work. It doesn't necessarily change, I guess, it doesn't change the nature of the work. I'll leave that alone because I'm speaking out of my depth a little bit. But at the end of the day, I really want to say very graciously, thank you so much to Louis Al-Hashimi and Dixie Downing for sharing their experiences with the Schar School, talking a little bit about, their careers and just kind of, what they've been doing. And so I want to give the floor to them one last time to kind of share one bit of wisdom. What would be one thing you would recommend for students or for potential students to do when they're in the Schar School? And Dixie, we'll start with you.
Make as many friends as you can. Make friends with your professors. Your classmates are probably you're randomly going to have really incredible classmates who. I had one who was the assistant secretary of something at the Pentagon, and it was like, you're taking this class with me. Get to know everyone that you can, because networking at the Schar School is incredible and you will not regret it.
Yeah, and for me, it would be similar. Again, it would just be to take advantage of the resources that are available to you. Try to learn from the people around you, the professors, classmates. Take advantage of the support that's available to you. You have Dwayne and Brian here to guide you in terms of career development, and try to be as proactive as possible in your professional development.
Oh yeah, and definitely, as Louis and I put in the chat, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. We are here because we want to help and we want to see more GMU students succeed.
Absolutely.
Very good. Thank you both so much once again. If anybody has any questions or would like to follow up with us, please feel free to email Dwayne Bradshaw at the email listed in the chat. Thank you all so much for attending tonight. We hope you have a fantastic rest of the week and that you are enjoying this, no doubt, wonderful weather.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
All
Bye,
right.
everyone.
Thank you. Good night.